Well, thanks everybody. I second to last, but hopefully not second to least. So I'm going to talk today about some very new work. So when the call for what we're going to talk about went out, I thought, well, what should I do? Should I talk about something that I already know, or should I talk about something new? And so I said, how about I do something on data that just got released a week ago, and we'll see what happens. So you're going to see the results of that. Okay. And then it's even more hot off the presses because after this morning's conversation about essential work, I went back upstairs and I was like, oh, let me look at some of these things that we've been talking about. So I have notes for a slide that is not in my talk. Okay. Do I just click? Okay, there we go. Okay.
Conferences like this contribute to scientific innovation.
Exactly, on the fly. So this is a team effort with myself, Ethan Lynn at Bowling Green, Judy Seltzer at UCLA, and Joe Hotz at Duke. And on this particular project, we have excellent research assistants from Halim Yoon, who's a PhD student at UCLA, and Janica Chin, who is a PhD student at BGSU. So the overall goal of the big project is to kind of create, but I probably should say curate, a contextual database that's linked to multiple generations in two data sets, in the panel study of income dynamics and in the health and retirement study. And it's linked based on lots of different ways that we can think about contexts in which people experience the pandemic, where they live, where they work, what occupation they're doing, which is what I'm going to do today. And so we're kind of thinking about ways that we can link that across multiple generations in two different data sets. We're also going to describe how health and economic challenges were shared among family members and how this differs across socioeconomic status and demographic groups. And that is the aim that this work falls under. We're going to look at assistance that family members gave one another and how that interacted with public form of assistance, and then look at the effects of that assistance on health. Okay, so the motivation for thinking about frontline and essential workers is that, and I'm going to talk a little bit in 2 slides about how we define this, but frontline or essential workers, we think, faced unique challenges during the pandemic. We know from work by a bunch of people who looked at kind of pre-pandemic characteristics that frontline workers were sort of less educated, lower wage, more likely to be immigrants, and more likely to be Hispanic than non-frontline work. We think that they were exposed to substantial health risks on the job, especially earlier in the pandemic before the vaccines were available. The demographics of the group suggest that they may have faced childcare difficulties, although I'm going to hopefully show you some things about frontline workers that maybe you didn't know. And they're also still exposed to high levels of unemployment. So even though they were doing work that was essential and that they needed to do in person, just like all of us, they were exposed to the demand conditions that were generated by the pandemic. And so when we think about how people cope with these types of challenges that kind of come in the not enough money and not enough time categories, one way in which people do that is by relying on their spouses and relying on their family members. And these are people who are in our data sets. So we're going to be able to look a little bit about what they gave each other. But we also know that both spouses and parents and children have kind of very high correlations in education and occupation. So those are things that are correlated with frontline work. So one thing we're interested in is, what does your safety net look like if everybody in your safety net is an essential worker? Okay, that's the framework that we started thinking about. And I'm going to show you a little bit in the data that says, actually, it's not exactly what we thought it would be. So the research questions I'm going to talk about today, first, I'm just going to look at spousal and parent-child correlations in frontline worker status. And I'm going to look at how frontline work is correlated with financial hardship. I may or may not get to thinking about how family correlations affected financial hardship, because there's so much more interesting things to talk about with this group about how we measure stuff, right? So that's the great thing about being here. And then finally, we are going to look, and I'll talk about this at the end, about how these things are correlated with care time and work time that people engaged in during the pandemic. Okay, so I think there are lots of interrelated concepts floating around. And so I thought I would talk about how we're defining essential and frontline work, and then talk about how else we might be able to define it and how else we might be able to measure it. Because I think that everyone this is the Wild West, everybody's doing something different. And so I think it's important to think about those concepts. So I want to talk about 3 interrelated concepts. One, and I don't know how these are distinguished, but I'll just tell you how I'm distinguishing them. Okay, so we have a set of workers that were deemed essential because they were involved in industries that were deemed necessary for critical infrastructure. And this one definition of this is one that the Department of Homeland Security put out, which changed over time, of course, like everything. But they put out a set of industries that were sort of necessary to kind of keep the nation running. Okay. This is a very big set of industries. Okay. Then in that group, there are people who are able to work from home and people who are not able to work from home. And so when we think about how we might colloquially define an essential worker, that might be someone who was in an essential industry, so they were supposed to keep working and they couldn't work from home, right? So now we have to figure out how we measure whether people could work from home. And there's a bunch of different ways to do that. We've kind of implemented one way which uses ONET data to classify whether a job is mostly done in person. Okay. And then there were also industries that are mostly done in person, but some of which were actually shut down at different times during the pandemic. So I'm just going to give an example. So if you're a flight attendant, you're an essential worker because air transportation was an essential industry. Okay. You're a frontline worker because being a flight attendant is something that you do in person, but you were in a shutdown industry because commercial air travel was basically non-existent in the very early days of the pandemic, right? So that's just an example of how you can be, different people are in different categories for multiple reasons, okay? Okay, so I'm going to tell you what data set we're using, and then I'm going to do the missing slide. Okay, so we're going to use the panel study of income dynamics. We're going to use the 2019 and 2021 waves, and we're going to define essential work, sort of define work type. We're going to define people as essential workers or not essential workers, frontline workers or not frontline workers, and frontline workers excluding the shutdown sectors or not frontline workers excluding shutdown sectors. And we're going to do this based on their 2019 industry and occupation. And actually, of course, it's more complicated than just this because people are asked to report about 4 jobs. So we know the industry and occupation of each of their 4 jobs. And so we actually look at whether any of your 4 jobs is essential, and then any of your 4 jobs is essential plus low work from home, or essential plus low work from home and excluding shutdown. Okay. When I talk about how else we could measure this, I can talk a little bit about what we know about when you were doing which job, but that's even more complicated. So we measure the work characteristics and worker characteristics in 2019. So we have a sample of people who were working in 2019. And then we measure outcomes in 2021 because this is panel data as is stated in its name. We have 3 different samples going here. We have a sample of kind of all adults, more or less, in the PSID. So these are all heads and spouses if you're a PSID person. We also have a sample of couples. These are different gender couples who are married or have been cohabiting for at least a year. And we have child parent dyads. So we have children who are themselves adults who are heads and spouses who are linked to their parents who are also a head and spouse. And this is because those are the only people about whom we know an occupation in an industry. We don't, for example, for most kids who are like living with their parents and have never left home. Well, we do for some of them, but anyway, by and large, we know less about their industry and occupation. Okay, so we have 3 different samples too. So now for my missing slide. So there are lots of, this is just one way of measuring this, right? So I was trying to think about how we can measure this. So we're measuring this in a very particular way. We're using your pre-pandemic sort of jobs to define whether we think going into the pandemic you were an essential worker. So your essential worker status may change. You might become an essential worker during the pandemic. You maybe get laid off from your non-essential work job and then go work as an essential worker in a grocery store because they're hiring, right? So we have temporal change. We also have different ways of defining essential work. So I don't see the NANDA folks here, but they define essential work in a very different way. So they use an ACLU definition, which I believe is based only on occupation, whereas we're using a definition that's based on the cross of occupation and industry, right? So that's a different definition. Another way to do it is to ask people if they were essential workers. And the PSID did this in 2021. So I can tell you a little bit about what we know from that. So from that, we know that according to our categorization and people's own categorization, we have about a 70% match, but that means 30% of people either say they were an essential worker where we wouldn't have categorized them that way, or say they weren't an essential worker when we would have categorized them the opposite way, right? And this is, of course, complicated because the PSID asks if anyone in you or anyone in your household was an essential worker. So there's slippage there too, because we're measuring multiple people in households. We're missing occupations for some people in households, and we have people who may have changed status. All of this is to say that how we measure this and operationalize this, to draw on a point that Elaine made earlier, is very data set specific and very question specific. And so thinking about how we can make progress on what we learn is so important, that we work together, at least amongst ourselves, to sort of be open about the choices that we're making and how those can harmonize across different data sets. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the samples that we have. So first of all, how many people are essential workers? So essential workers are about 70% of the labor market. And this is consistent with estimates from from the ACS. So if you just take all the essential industries, the one the Department of Homeland Security said are critical for our national infrastructure, that's 70% of workers, okay? Frontline workers are a much smaller group. We, in our data set in the PSID, it's about 35%. In the ACS, it's a little more, 42%, but close. And then there's just a small bit of difference between being a frontline worker and being a frontline worker, excluding the shutdown industries, right? So the vast majority of workers are essential, but only about a third of workers are actually frontline. The rest, I won't talk about the demographics of our samples. They differ in the ways you would think. But let's talk about the characteristics of the workers themselves. So essential workers look a lot like the labor force overall. It's about half male, half female. About 40% of people have a BA. But the thing to notice about frontline work, and I think this is probably something that people wouldn't expect, frontline workers are actually men are overrepresented among frontline workers. And it's because a lot of frontline work that we saw, the client-facing frontline work, is done by women, but a lot of frontline work that involves like keeping manufacturing open and doing sort of that more industrial frontline work is done by men. So men are overrepresented among frontline workers. Frontline workers are less educated than essential workers. They're less white than essential workers. They're in worse health than essential workers, and they have lower pre-pandemic income than essential workers. Okay. I could just tell you a little bit about what they said they experienced. So in general, about 25% of people report that they or someone else in their household was laid off, and this is higher among frontline workers than essential workers. About a third of families said that they lost earnings. And again, this is higher among frontline than essential workers. About 25% or 22% said they had financial difficulties. Again, this is higher among frontline than essential workers. But once they had financial difficulties, they coped with them in very similar ways. So the remainder just tells you how many people said they did these things. The differences between groups really come in that frontline workers are more likely to delay bills, report getting help from family members, and use food banks. Okay. I'm going to show you just two more things, and then I'm going to stop. So the first thing that we looked at is whether essential and frontline work is correlated across couples. And one thing that struck us right away, so here in our couples, the husband has to have been working before the pandemic, but the wife may not have been. So there are correlations in essential and frontline work between couples, but about a third of essential working men in heterosexual couples had a wife who wasn't working. So when we think about who's like filling in the gap, that non-working spouse is very important, right? And if we look at parents and kids, that's even bigger. So there are no parent-child correlations in essential work, but there are parent-child correlations in frontline work, as we would expect because of parent-child correlations in SES. But a lot of frontline workers had a non-working parent, right? So one thing that we're really interested in is like, what did these people do then, right? And that's one thing that we're going to get to. I'm just going to show you one more thing, which is that essential workers were less likely to say that they had financial difficulties during the pandemic than non-essential workers. And that is true no matter what set of stuff we control for pre-pandemic characteristics, including their income and wealth prior to the pandemic. And this is because they were less likely to get laid off. So if we add getting laid off, those differences disappear, right? But for frontline workers, you can see that they are demographically more vulnerable, but that once we control for demographics, basically they're no different than other people in terms of reports of financial difficulties. So frontline workers and essential workers are really very different. I'm gonna skip this because that's, too much. I only have 30 seconds. So just I don't want to do the conclusions. I want to do some next steps. So the differences between the essential and frontline workers suggest that we really need to think about the labor market as like split into these kind of essential but not frontline, et cetera, that we have to think very carefully about what it means to be an essential worker. And then what we're doing now is looking at work and childcare time in the couples to see how correlations in spousal essential worker affected who did more childcare, for example. And we're doing the same thing with reports of financial support from family and also parents' reports about time spent in childcare with their kids. So I'll end there and thank you very much.